Number 1. The Villisca Axe Murders. The quiet agricultural community of Villisca, Iowa, was forever scarred on the morning of June 10, 1912, when a horrific discovery was made at the residence of Josiah B. Moore, a well-respected local businessman. The night before had been a typical Sunday evening for the Moore family. Josiah, his wife Sarah, their 4 children, Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul, had attended the Presbyterian church where Josiah sang in the choir. After the service, they walked home with 2 visiting children, Ina and Lena Stillinger, who were spending the night at the Moore house. The group arrived home around 9:45 in the evening, and by 10 o'clock, the gas lamps throughout the house had been extinguished. What happened in the hours that followed remains one of the most chilling and baffling mysteries in American criminal history. The following morning, a neighbor named Mary Peckham noticed that the Moore home was unusually quiet and that the front door was still latched from the inside. She attempted to reach the family by knocking and calling out, but received no response. As concern grew, Mary contacted Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, who arrived at the house and attempted to peer through the windows. Unable to see anything clearly, Ross obtained a key and entered the home with Mary Peckham following closely behind. The scene that greeted them inside the upstairs bedroom was one of unimaginable carnage. Blood had soaked through the bedding and pooled on the wooden floor. All 6 members of the Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls had been brutally murdered while they slept. Each victim had been struck multiple times in the head with an axe that belonged to Josiah Moore. The weapon was found in the downstairs bedroom, leaning against the wall with the blade covered in dried blood and a portion of a washcloth wrapped around the handle, apparently in an attempt to muffle the sound of the strikes. As news of the massacre spread through the small town of approximately 2,000 residents, a wave of absolute terror and disbelief washed over the community. The Montgomery County Sheriff was quickly summoned, along with a local doctor who confirmed the grim reality that all 8 victims had suffered severe skull fractures and brain damage from the axe blows. The investigation began almost immediately, but the methods of forensic science in 1912 were rudimentary at best. Law enforcement focused primarily on canvassing the area, interviewing neighbors, and searching for a motive. The crime scene itself told a fragmented story that investigators struggled to piece together. The killer had entered the house either through the unlocked front door or through a ground floor window that was found slightly ajar. Once inside, the assailant had gone to the downstairs bedroom where the Stillinger girls were sleeping and attacked them first. Ina Stillinger, who was 13 years old, showed signs of having put up a struggle, with defensive wounds on her arms, and there were indications that she may have been sexually assaulted, though this detail was kept from the public for decades. Her younger sister Lena was also killed in that room. The killer then moved upstairs to the master bedroom where Josiah and Sarah Moore were asleep, striking them with devastating force. From there, the murderer proceeded to the adjacent bedrooms where the 4 more children were sleeping. The precision and lack of noise suggested that the victims never woke up during the attacks, which meant the killer was either remarkably quiet or the blows were delivered with such speed and force that consciousness was lost instantly. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the crime scene was what the killer did after the murders. All the mirrors in the house had been covered with cloth or clothing. A piece of a 2-pound slab of bacon was found sitting on the floor in one of the bedrooms, and a plate of uneaten food was left on the dining table. A pitcher of water had been placed in the upstairs hallway, and the killer had apparently washed their hands or the weapon in a basin. The gas lamps throughout the house had been carefully turned down, not turned off, which suggested the killer needed some visibility to navigate the dark house but wanted to keep the light low enough to avoid detection from outside. These bizarre ritualistic behaviors baffled investigators and led to rampant speculation about the psychological profile of the murderer. Several suspects emerged in the weeks and months following the killings, but none could be definitively linked to the crime. William Mansfield, a laborer from Illinois, was considered a strong suspect because he had allegedly committed a similar axe murder of his own family a few years later, and a train conductor claimed to have seen Mansfield near the Villisca train station on the morning of the murders. Mansfield was arrested and subjected to intense questioning, but he had alibis that could not be entirely disproven, and physical evidence connecting him to the Moore home was non-existent. Another prominent suspect was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister who had been in Villisca on the night of the murders and had reportedly left town very early the next morning. Kelly had a history of mental instability and had shown what some described as an unsettling interest in the more children during church services. He was arrested and tried for the murders in 1917, but the trial ended in a hung jury. A second trial in 1918 also resulted in an acquittal, largely because the evidence against him was circumstantial and the prosecution failed to present a compelling motive. A third suspect, Frank F. Jones, was a prominent Villisca businessman who had been involved in a bitter financial dispute with Josiah Moore. Jones had allegedly threatened Moore over a business deal, and some believed he hired a killer to carry out the murders as an act of revenge. Despite persistent rumors and investigations by private detectives hired by the Moore family, no evidence ever surfaced to connect Jones to the crime. The failure to solve the Villisca axe murders had a profound and lasting impact on the community. Many families moved away in the months following the killings, unable to bear the fear and trauma of living in a town where such a monster could strike without warning. The Moore house itself changed hands several times over the decades, with most owners unable to stay for long due to the home's dark reputation. The house eventually became a tourist attraction of sorts, drawing true crime enthusiasts and paranormal investigators who were drawn to the lingering mystery and reported supernatural occurrences. The legal aftermath of the case exposed the severe limitations of early 20th-century investigative techniques. Evidence was contaminated as neighbors, family members, and curious onlookers walked freely through the crime scene before it was properly secured. Fingerprints, which could have been invaluable, were not systematically collected or compared. The axe was handled by multiple people before being properly examined. These procedural failures, while understandable for the era, haunted the case for generations and served as a grim lesson in the importance of crime scene preservation. Over the decades, numerous theories have been proposed by amateur sleuths, historians, and criminologists. Some have suggested the killer was a transient drifter or a traveling laborer who passed through Villisca on the railroad and was never seen again. Others have pointed to the possibility of a serial killer who may have been responsible for similar axe murders in other Midwestern towns during the same period, including the murders in Blue Island, Illinois, in 1911, and the murders in Monmouth, Illinois, in 1918. These cases shared striking similarities, including the use of an axe belonging to the victims, attacks occurring at night, and the covering of mirrors or windows. Whether these crimes were connected to a single roaming killer or were the work of separate individuals has never been determined. The Villisca axe murders remain officially unsolved more than a century later. No one was ever convicted for the brutal slaying of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters. The case files, what remain of them, are scattered across various archives, and the physical evidence has long since been lost or destroyed. The Moore family is buried in the Villisca cemetery, their graves a quiet testament to a tragedy that defied explanation. The house still stands on East 2nd Street, mute witness to one of the most horrific crimes in Iowa history. For the descendants of the victims and the residents of Villisca, the absence of closure is a wound that has never fully healed. The question of who entered that home on a warm June night and extinguished 8 lives with an axe remains as unanswered today as it was in 1912, a mystery that continues to haunt the American heartland and challenge our understanding of human evil. Number 2, the Black Dahlia. In the sprawling, sun-drenched landscape of post-World War II Los Angeles, a city that was rapidly becoming the entertainment capital of the world, a young woman named Elizabeth Short arrived with the same dreams that drew thousands of hopeful migrants to the West Coast. Born on July 29, 1924, in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts, Elizabeth was the third of 5 daughters born to Cleo and Phoebe Short. Her early life was marked by the kind of middle-class stability that defined much of pre-Depression America, but that stability was shattered when her father, a successful carpenter and small-time businessman, abandoned the family by staging his own suicide, parking his car near a bridge and leaving a note that suggested he had jumped into the Charles River. Cleo Short had actually fled to California, a fact that Elizabeth would not discover until years later. The abandonment left a deep psychological mark on Elizabeth, who grew into a strikingly beautiful but emotionally fragile young woman with pale skin, dark hair, and a reputation for being somewhat withdrawn and dreamy. She developed a chronic respiratory condition, possibly asthma or bronchitis, which led doctors to recommend she move to a warmer, drier climate. In the early 1940s, Elizabeth moved to Miami, where she lived for a time and worked various low-paying jobs, including as a waitress. She was known for her beauty and her tendency to gravitate toward the company of military servicemen, and she developed a habit of flirting and socializing without forming deep romantic attachments, a pattern that would later be mischaracterized and weaponized against her by the press. In 1943, Elizabeth moved to Los Angeles to be near her father, whom she had finally tracked down in the California Bay Area. She briefly stayed with him, but the reunion was strained and uncomfortable for both of them, and Elizabeth soon struck out on her own in the city. Over the next several years, she lived a transient lifestyle, moving between Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco, staying with friends, acquaintances, and occasionally in hotels and rooming houses. She had no steady income and no clear career path, but she was known among her social circle for her love of movies, her elegant sense of style, and her habit of wearing all-black clothing that contrasted dramatically with her fair complexion, a sartorial choice that would later contribute to her infamous nickname. By January 1947, Elizabeth Short was 22 years old and living in Los Angeles, reportedly hoping to reunite with a man she had met during the war, a lieutenant named Gordon Fickling, who was stationed in Northern California. She was last seen alive on the evening of January 9, 1947, at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Witnesses reported seeing her in the lobby, apparently waiting for someone, though the identity of that person was never established. She was also reportedly seen at a nearby diner and later at a bus stop on Sunset Boulevard. From that point forward, Elizabeth Short vanished from the public eye. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a housewife named Betty Berzinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter through the Leimert Park neighborhood of South Los Angeles, an area that was at the time a relatively new and well-maintained residential district. As she passed an empty lot on the south side of Norton Avenue, between 39th and Coliseum Streets, Berzinger noticed what appeared to be a mannequin lying in the grass. As she drew closer, the horrific truth became apparent. The body was that of a young woman who had been bisected at the waist, with the two halves of her torso positioned in a deliberate and grotesque arrangement. The upper half of the body was positioned with the arms raised above the head, the elbows bent at right angles, and the legs spread in a stylized pose. The body had been completely drained of blood, and the skin had been washed clean, giving it a porcelain-like appearance that contrasted sickeningly with the mutilations that had been inflicted upon it. The face had been slashed from the corners of the mouth to the ears, creating what investigators described as a Glasgow smile, and there were numerous cuts and abrasions across the body, some of which appeared to have been made before death and others after. The lower half of the body had been placed a short distance away from the upper half, with the intestines tucked neatly beneath the buttocks, an arrangement that suggested a disturbing level of surgical precision and deliberate staging. The discovery of the body triggered one of the largest and most sensationalized investigations in the history of the Los Angeles Police Department. Homicide detectives arrived at the scene within minutes and were immediately confronted with the enormity of the task before them. The crime scene was contaminated almost from the start, as curious onlookers, reporters, and even off-duty police officers trampled through the empty lot, destroying potential evidence. Despite the chaos, investigators were able to gather some crucial details. The body was identified through fingerprints as Elizabeth Short, who had been arrested in Santa Barbara in 1943 for underage drinking and whose prints were on file. The autopsy, conducted by the chief medical examiner, revealed that Elizabeth had died from hemorrhage and shock resulting from the massive wounds to her face and body, as well as the bisection of her torso. The examiner noted that the cuts used to bisect the body were remarkably clean and appeared to have been made by someone with anatomical knowledge or surgical skill, possibly using a surgical scalpel or a similarly sharp instrument. The bisection had been performed after death, and there was no evidence of sexual assault, though this finding has been debated by subsequent analysts. The investigation into Elizabeth Short's murder consumed the Los Angeles Police Department for months and generated thousands of pages of reports, interviews, and tips. Detectives fanned out across the city and beyond, interviewing anyone who had known Elizabeth or had any connection to her, however tenuous. What they found was a portrait of a young woman who had been adrift in a city that could be both glamorous and unforgiving. Elizabeth had no fixed address, no job, and no steady source of income at the time of her death. She had stayed with dozens of different people over the preceding months, and she was known to frequent restaurants, bars, and nightclubs along Hollywood Boulevard and the Sunset Strip. She had been romantically involved with several men, including a married salesman named Robert Manley, who was the last confirmed person to have seen her alive before she disappeared from the Biltmore Hotel. Manley was interrogated at length and given a polygraph test, which he passed, and he was eventually eliminated as a suspect. Other individuals who were investigated included a wealthy Los Angeles dentist named George Hodel, who had been accused by his own son, Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD homicide detective, of being the Black Dahlia killer decades after the fact. Steve Hodel's theory, published in a 2003 book, argued that his father, who was a brilliant but deeply disturbed man with a history of sexual misconduct, had the surgical skill, the motive, and the opportunity to commit the murder. He pointed to alleged links between his father and Elizabeth Short, as well as to cryptic entries in George Hodel's diary that seemed to reference the killing. While the theory generated enormous public interest, it has been strongly contested by other researchers and law enforcement officials, who argue that the evidence is circumstantial and that Steve Hodel's interpretation of the diary entries is speculative at best. Another suspect was a Los Angeles nightclub owner and organized crime figure named Mark Hansen, who had allowed Elizabeth to stay at one of his properties and who was known to have a volatile temper. Hansen was investigated and interrogated but never charged, and most investigators believe he was not involved in the murder. The media coverage of the Black Dahlia case was unprecedented in its scope and its savagery. The Los Angeles Examiner, a Hearst newspaper, was the first to break the story, and its reporters descended on the case with a ferocity that shocked even the jaded sensibilities of the Los Angeles press corps. The newspaper reportedly contacted Elizabeth's mother in Massachusetts and deceived her into believing that her daughter had won a beauty contest, only to reveal the truth of her murder once they had secured an exclusive interview. The press coined the nickname Black Dahlia as a reference to Elizabeth's habit of wearing black clothing and to a contemporary film called The Blue Dahlia, and the name stuck, transforming Elizabeth Short from a real human being into a morbid cultural icon. The coverage focused obsessively on Elizabeth's personal life, her romantic relationships, and her supposed promiscuity, painting a portrait of a young woman who had somehow brought her own murder upon herself through her behavior. This victim-blaming narrative was typical of the era but was particularly vicious in the Black Dahlia case, and it had the effect of shifting public attention away from the investigation and toward the salacious details of Elizabeth's short and troubled life. Despite the massive expenditure of time, money, and manpower, the LAPD was never able to identify a definitive suspect in the Black Dahlia murder, and the case went cold. Over the years, more than 50 individuals have been proposed as potential killers, ranging from serial killers like Jack the Ripper copycats to random drifters to prominent Los Angeles figures. No single theory has ever been supported by conclusive physical evidence, and no one has ever been charged with the crime. The official case file remains open with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, and the LAPD continues to list the Black Dahlia murder as an unsolved homicide. The cultural impact of the case has been enormous and enduring. Elizabeth Short has become a symbol of the dark side of Hollywood, a cautionary tale about the dangers that lurk beneath the glittering surface of the entertainment industry. Her story has inspired dozens of books, films, television episodes, songs, and works of art, and her image, reconstructed from her death photographs and from photographs taken during her life, is one of the most recognizable in the true crime canon. But beneath the mythology and the sensationalism, the Black Dahlia case is, at its core, the story of a real person, a young woman from a fractured family who came to Los Angeles looking for something better and found instead a brutal and senseless death. The fact that her killer was never caught, and that the truth of what happened to her in those missing days in January 1947 has never been fully revealed, is a failure that continues to haunt the city of Los Angeles and the annals of American criminal justice. The Norton Avenue lot where her body was found has been transformed by development, and the streets of Leimert Park no longer bear any visible trace of the horror that once made them infamous. But the name Black Dahlia endures, a grim shorthand for one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in American history, and a reminder that even in a city built on fantasy and illusion, some mysteries are all too real. Number 3, the Somerton Man, also known as the Tamanshid case. Stud on the morning of December 1, 1948, at approximately 6:30, the sun was rising over the coastal suburb of Somerton Park in Adelaide, South Australia, when a jogger named John Bain Dovers noticed a man lying on the sand near the base of the cenotaph, a war memorial situated on the Esplanade, a grassy strip of land that runs parallel to the beach. At first glance, Dovers assumed the man was simply sleeping off a night of drinking, as it was not uncommon for people to frequent the Esplanade at night. However, when Dovers passed the same spot again later that morning around 7:30 and noticed the man had not moved and was lying in exactly the same rigid position, a sense of unease settled over him. He mentioned what he had seen to another passerby, and eventually, the police were contacted. When officers from the South Australia Police arrived at the scene shortly after, it became immediately apparent that the man was dead. The body was lying on its back with the head resting against the sea wall and the legs crossed at the ankles and the feet pointing toward the water. The man was impeccably dressed in a suit and tie, polished shoes, and a freshly pressed coat, an attire that seemed entirely incongruous with the idea of a homeless drifter or a transient laborer. There was no hat, which was unusual for a well-dressed man of that era, and no wallet, no identification of any kind, and no money was found on the body. The pockets contained only a partially smoked packet of juicy fruit chewing gum, a pack of Kensitas cigarettes containing 7 cigarettes of a different brand called Army Club that had been slipped into the Kensitas packet, a box of matches, and a narrow aluminum bus ticket from the Adelaide city centre to the beach suburb of Somerton, which had been purchased at approximately 10:45 the previous evening. The man's face was clean-shaven, his hair was neatly trimmed and showed signs of recent professional grooming, and his hands and nails were free of any indication of manual labor, suggesting he was either a white-collar professional or a man of some means. An initial examination at the scene revealed no obvious signs of violence, no wounds, no bruises, and no evidence of a struggle. The body was transported to the Royal Adelaide Hospital, where a thorough post-mortem examination was conducted by the senior pathology lecturer at the University of Adelaide. The autopsy revealed a number of highly unusual and perplexing findings. The man's heart was of normal size but was completely empty of blood, a condition that the pathologist described as extraordinarily rare and inconsistent with natural causes. The liver was massively enlarged and congested with blood, and the stomach contained a small amount of partially digested food that appeared to be a pasty substance, possibly a type of pastry or pie. The spleen was enlarged to roughly 3 times its normal size, and there were significant abnormalities in the kidneys and the pancreas. The pathologist concluded that the man had died from acute heart failure, but the underlying cause of that heart failure could not be determined through the autopsy alone. The pathologist noted that the condition of the internal organs was consistent with severe poisoning, possibly by a compound such as digitalis, which is derived from the foxglove plant and was commonly used at the time to treat heart conditions but could be lethal in even slightly elevated doses. Digitalis poisoning was notoriously difficult to detect because it mimicked natural heart failure and left no characteristic chemical traces in the tissues using the forensic methods available in 1948. Despite extensive toxicological testing, no specific poison was ever identified in the man's system, a fact that has fueled speculation for decades about whether he was murdered, whether he committed suicide, or whether he died from some unknown natural cause. As the investigation into the man's identity progressed, it quickly became apparent that this was not going to be a straightforward case. The South Australia Police conducted an exhaustive search, fingerprinting the body and circulating the prints to police departments across Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. No match was ever found. The man's fingerprints were not on file in any known database, a highly unusual circumstance for an adult male of that era, when fingerprinting was a standard procedure for a wide range of activities including military service, government employment, and various licensing requirements. Photographs of the man's face were published in newspapers and displayed at public locations throughout Adelaide, but despite a massive public response and hundreds of claimed identifications, not a single person was able to positively identify the body. The man, it seemed, had simply materialized out of nowhere and died on a beach without a single soul knowing who he was. Several months after the body was discovered, in April 1949, a critical breakthrough appeared to present itself when police conducted a thorough re-examination of the man's clothing. A hidden pocket was found sewn into the lining of the man's trousers, and within that pocket was a small, tightly rolled piece of paper that had apparently been overlooked during the initial searches. When unrolled, the paper was found to be a torn scrap from a book, printed with the words, "Taman should," which are the final words of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of quatrains attributed to the 12th-century Persian poet and mathematician. The phrase, "Taman should" translates roughly from Persian as "ended" or "finished," and in the context of the poem, it signifies the end of life and the finality of death. The discovery of this cryptic fragment transformed the case from a simple unidentified body investigation into one of the most baffling mysteries in criminal history. A public appeal was launched to find the book from which the page had been torn, and within weeks, a man came forward to report that he had found a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in the back seat of his car, which had been parked on Jetty Road in Glenelg, a suburb adjacent to Somerton, several weeks before the body was discovered. The book was handed over to police, and on the inside back cover, faint pencil markings were discovered that appeared to be a series of letters and numbers arranged in 5 lines. The markings read as follows, with the letters appearing to be grouped in a pattern that suggested some form of code or cipher. Rugobab mliawi watbim poet nayi itirivmap wimpliba. Cryptographers from the Australian Department of Defence, the Navy, and various academic institutions were brought in to analyze the code, but none of them were able to decipher it. The code did not match any known cipher system of the era, and theories about its meaning ranged from a secret military message to a personal journal entry to the name of a location or a person written in an obscure shorthand. Despite decades of analysis by professional and amateur codebreakers from around the world, the Somerton Man code has never been definitively cracked, and its meaning, if it has one, remains a complete mystery. Further investigation of the Rubaiyat book itself revealed a telephone number that had been written in ink on the front inside cover. The number belonged to a woman named Jessica Ellen Thompson, a nurse who lived in Mosley Street, Glenelg, a short distance from where the body had been found and close to where the book had been discovered in the car. When police interviewed Jessica Thompson, she denied knowing the dead man and denied any connection to the Rubaiyat book. However, when shown a plaster cast of the man's face, she appeared to become visibly distressed and quickly looked away, a reaction that the interviewing officers found significant and suspicious. Jessica Thompson provided police with a detailed account of her movements on the night of November 30th and the morning of December 1st, and her alibi appeared to hold up under scrutiny. She told police that she had lent a copy of the Rubaiyat to a man named Alf Boxall during the war years, but when police tracked down Boxall, he was found to be very much alive and in possession of his own copy of the book, with the Taman should page still intact. The connection between Jessica Thompson and the Somerton Man remained tantalizingly out of reach, and despite repeated interviews over the following years, she never wavered from her position that she did not know the dead man. In the years that followed, the Somerton Man case became a national obsession in Australia and attracted the attention of international investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths. Numerous theories were proposed to explain the man's identity and the circumstances of his death. Some researchers suggested he was a Soviet spy or intelligence agent who had been eliminated by his own handlers, pointing to the apparent code, the lack of identification, and the fact that the body was found near a sensitive defense installation. Others proposed that he was a jilted lover who had traveled to Adelaide to confront Jessica Thompson and, upon being rejected, had taken his own life using a poison that could not be detected. Still others argued that the man was simply a transient who had died of natural causes, and that the code, the book, and the hidden pocket were all elaborate coincidences or red herrings. In the 21st century, advances in forensic science offered new avenues for investigation. In 2021, a team of researchers led by Professor Derek Abbott at the University of Adelaide extracted DNA from a sample of the Somerton Man's hair that had been preserved since the original autopsy. Through genealogical DNA analysis, the team was able to identify the man as Carl Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker who was born in 1905 in Melbourne, Victoria. Webb had served in the Australian military during World War II and had been married to a woman named Dorothy Robertson, whom he had divorced. Dorothy was subsequently identified as the woman known as Jessica Ellen Thompson, who had changed her name after the divorce and moved to South Australia. The identification of Carl Webb appeared to resolve the most fundamental question of the case, the identity of the dead man, but it raised almost as many questions as it answered. If the man was Carl Webb, why had no one, including his own family, ever come forward to identify him? Why was his body found in Adelaide, far from his home in Melbourne? And what was the meaning of the cryptic code that was found in the Rubaiyat book? Despite the DNA identification, the South Australian coroner has not yet made a formal ruling on the cause of death, and the question of whether Carl Webb was murdered, committed suicide, or died of natural causes remains officially undetermined. The code has not been broken, and the full circumstances leading to Webb's presence on the Somerton Park beach on the night of November 30, 1948, have not been established. The Tamanshud case, even with the remarkable breakthrough of genetic identification, stands as a testament to the enduring power of mystery and the limits of human understanding. A man died on a quiet beach more than 75 years ago, surrounded by clues that seemed to promise answers but delivered only deeper layers of enigma. The Somerton man was buried in the West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide in 1949, in a grave marked simply by the words, "Here lies the unknown man of Somerton." Even now, with a name finally attached to the grave, the mystery of who Carl Webb was in his final hours and what brought him to that beach remains as deep and as impenetrable as the ocean that lay just a few steps from where his body was found. Number 4, The Boy in the Box. On a cold and overcast February morning in 1957, a young man named John Pascal was driving his truck along a secluded dirt road in the Fox Chase neighborhood of northeast Philadelphia, a semi-rural area on the outskirts of the city that was known for its dense woods, scattered farms, and relative isolation from the urban sprawl. Pascal was checking a small trap line he had set in the area to catch rabbits, a common pastime in that part of Pennsylvania at the time. As he navigated his vehicle along Susquehanna Road, a narrow and poorly maintained strip of gravel and dirt that cut through a thick stand of trees, he noticed something unusual off to the side of the road, partially concealed by underbrush and discarded debris. What he initially took to be a discarded doll or a bundle of rags turned out, upon closer inspection, to be the lifeless body of a small boy. The child was lying inside a large, corrugated cardboard box that had originally contained a bassinet from the J.C. Penney department store. The box was open and placed on its side, and the boy's body was found nude, wrapped in a cheap flannel blanket that was stained with blood. The sight was so shocking and disturbing that Pascal immediately drove to a nearby business to contact the police. When officers from the Philadelphia Police Department arrived at the scene, they were confronted with a crime scene that would haunt the city for more than 6 decades. The child was a Caucasian male, estimated to be between 4 and 6 years old, with light brown hair that had been recently cropped in a rough, uneven manner that suggested someone without professional training had cut it, possibly after death to obscure identification through hairstyle comparison. The boy was approximately 3 feet tall and weighed about 30 pounds, which was significantly underweight for a child of his apparent age, suggesting chronic malnutrition or neglect. His fingernails had been trimmed neatly, a detail that seemed paradoxical given the otherwise neglected condition of his body, and there were faint scars on his ankle, chin, and groin area that indicated he had received some form of medical treatment during his lifetime, possibly for a minor surgical procedure. The cause of death was determined by the medical examiner to be blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. There were also signs that the child had been subjected to prolonged abuse and malnourishment over an extended period of time, with multiple old bruises and injuries in various stages of healing found on his small body. Despite the brutality of the murder, the boy had been washed clean after death, his hair had been carefully combed forward, and his body had been placed in the bassinet box in a manner that some investigators described as almost tender, as if the killer had made a clumsy and misguided attempt at providing a proper burial. The crime scene yielded remarkably few clues. The bassinet box was traced to a J.C. Penney store in the Delaware Valley region, and it was determined that the box had been sold sometime in late 1956 or early 1957, but the store's sales records from that period were incomplete, and the specific purchaser was never identified. The flannel blanket was a mass-produced item that was sold in numerous stores across the Philadelphia area and could not be traced to a specific buyer. No fingerprints of value were recovered from the box or the blanket, and no other physical evidence was found at the scene that could point to a suspect. The most tantalizing clue discovered during the initial investigation was a man's handkerchief that was found near the body, printed with the letter T and what appeared to be a small decorative motif, possibly a flower or a crest. The handkerchief was circulated to the public in the hope that someone would recognize it, but no one ever came forward with definitive information about its origin. The Philadelphia Police Department launched one of the largest and most intensive investigations in the department's history, assigning dozens of detectives to the case full-time and following up on thousands of leads from across the country. The boy's fingerprints were taken and distributed to police agencies nationwide, and his photograph was published in newspapers and displayed on flyers that were distributed as far away as California and Florida. A reward was offered for information leading to the identification of the child or the arrest of his killer, and the case received extensive media coverage, including a nationally syndicated television segment on the popular crime show, The Fugitive, in which the show's host, a former police officer, appealed directly to the public for help. Despite this extraordinary effort, not a single person came forward to claim the boy, and no missing persons report from any jurisdiction in the United States could be matched to his description. The absence of a missing persons report was perhaps the most baffling and disturbing aspect of the case. It meant that no parent, no grandparent, no neighbor, no teacher, and no social worker had reported this child missing, which suggested either that the people responsible for his care were also responsible for his death, or that the child existed so far outside the normal structures of society that his disappearance went entirely unnoticed by anyone who would have had reason to care. Over the decades, the boy in the box case became one of America's most famous unsolved mysteries, and it generated an extraordinary number of tips, theories, and false confessions. In the 1960s, a woman named Martha, who was a patient at a psychiatric hospital in Philadelphia, told her social worker that her parents had purchased a young boy from an impoverished family and had brought him to live with them, and that the boy had been subjected to severe physical abuse and eventually killed by her parents, who then disposed of the body on Susquehanna Road. The woman's account contained a number of specific details that seemed to match the known facts of the case, including the location of the body and the manner of the child's death. Investigators spent months pursuing this lead, interviewing the woman's family members and attempting to corroborate her story, but they were ultimately unable to find any physical evidence to support her claims, and the theory was eventually set aside, though it has never been entirely dismissed. In the 1990s, a man came forward and claimed that his biological mother, a woman who operated a foster home in the Philadelphia area, had confessed to him on her deathbed that she had been responsible for the boy in the box murder. According to this account, the woman had taken in the boy as a foster child, had been unable to control him, and had beaten him to death in a fit of rage before disposing of his body on the roadside. This theory gained considerable traction in the media and among amateur investigators, but again, no physical evidence was ever found to connect the woman to the crime, and the claim remained unverified. In the early 2000s, a forensic artist working with the Philadelphia Police Department created a new facial reconstruction of the boy using modern techniques, and the image was widely distributed in the hope of generating new leads. The reconstruction showed a more lifelike and emotionally resonant image of the child, with wide eyes and a somber expression that seemed to capture the sadness of his brief and brutal life. The image generated a significant wave of public interest and a new batch of tips, but none of them led to a definitive identification. The breakthrough in the case finally came in 2022, when advances in forensic genetic genealogy, the same technique that had been used to identify the Somerton man, were applied to the boy in the box. DNA extracted from the child's remains during the original autopsy had been preserved, and a sample was submitted to a laboratory that specialized in genetic genealogy analysis. The laboratory was able to extract sufficient DNA to construct a genetic profile, which was then uploaded to public genealogy databases to search for distant relatives. Through a painstaking process of building out family trees and tracing genetic connections across multiple generations, researchers were able to identify the boy as Joseph Augustus Sorelli, who was born on January 13, 1953, in Philadelphia. The identification of Joseph Sorelli was announced at a press conference in November 2022 by the Philadelphia Police Department and the city's medical examiner, and it was a moment of profound emotional significance for the investigators who had worked on the case over the decades and for the public that had followed the mystery for so long. However, the identification of the child, while a monumental achievement, did not solve the crime. Joseph Sorelli's parents were identified through the genealogical research, but both were deceased, and the question of who was responsible for the boy's care at the time of his death and who inflicted the fatal injuries remained unanswered. The Philadelphia Police Department stated that the investigation into the murder was ongoing and that they were pursuing new leads generated by the identification, but as of the present, no arrest has been made and no suspect has been publicly named. The story of Joseph Augustus Sorelli, the boy in the box, is a profoundly heartbreaking narrative that speaks to the darkest corners of human behavior, the failure of communities to protect their most vulnerable members, and the extraordinary perseverance of those who refuse to let a child be forgotten. For 65 years, this little boy lay in an unmarked grave in a Philadelphia cemetery, known only by a number on a small white plaque. Following his identification, his grave was marked with a proper headstone bearing his name, a small but deeply meaningful act of restoration that acknowledged his humanity and his existence in a way that had been denied to him in life. The case of the boy in the box has had a lasting impact on the field of forensic investigation, demonstrating the power of genetic genealogy to solve cases that had been considered unsolvable and inspiring a new generation of investigators to apply cutting-edge science to cold cases. But for all the scientific achievement and public attention, the central tragedy of the case remains untouched. A child was abused, neglected, and beaten to death, and his body was discarded on a roadside like so much garbage, and the person or persons responsible for this atrocity have never been held to account. The question of who killed Joseph Augustus Sorelli and why remains an open wound, a mystery that even the marvels of modern science have not yet been able to fully close. Number 5, the Zodiac Killer. The late 1960s in Northern California were a time of profound cultural upheaval, a period defined by the Vietnam War protests, the rise of the counterculture movement, and a general atmosphere of social transformation that seemed to crack the foundation of traditional American life. It was against this turbulent backdrop that one of the most terrifying and enigmatic serial killers in the history of the United States emerged, a figure who would exploit the chaos of the era and use it as a cloak for a campaign of murder and psychological warfare that paralyzed an entire region and baffled law enforcement for more than half a century. The killer known as the Zodiac is believed to have committed at least 5 murders and 2 attempted murders in the San Francisco Bay Area between December 1968 and October 1969, though the killer himself claimed to have murdered as many as 37 people, a claim that has never been substantiated by investigators. The story of the Zodiac begins on the night of December 20, 1968, on a dark and isolated stretch of Lake Herman Road in Vallejo, California, a working-class city located approximately 30 miles northeast of San Francisco. David Faraday, a 17-year-old high school student, and Betty Lou Jensen, a 16-year-old classmate, had driven to a remote gravel turnout on the road, a popular spot for young couples to park and spend time together. As they sat in Faraday's station wagon, a second vehicle pulled into the turnout behind them and then abruptly pulled alongside. A man stepped out of the vehicle and approached the couple's car, shining a flashlight into the interior. David Faraday apparently exited the vehicle, possibly in an attempt to defuse the situation or to protect Betty Lou, and was immediately shot in the head at point-blank range. As Betty Lou attempted to flee from the passenger side of the car, she was chased by the assailant, who fired 5 shots at her, striking her in the back multiple times. She collapsed and died a short distance from the vehicle. The killer then returned to his car and drove away. The bodies were discovered a short time later by a passing motorist, and the subsequent investigation by the Solano County Sheriff's Office yielded remarkably few clues. No motive was apparent, as robbery did not appear to be a factor and neither victim had any known enemies. Shell casings recovered at the scene were determined to be from a 10mm Super Vel automatic pistol, a relatively uncommon caliber at the time. Despite an intensive canvass of the area and numerous interviews, no suspect was identified, and the case went cold, leaving the community of Vallejo shaken and bewildered. Just over 7 months later, on the 4th of July, 1969, the killer struck again, this time at the Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, only a few miles from the site of the first attack. Darlene Ferrin, a 22-year-old waitress and mother of two, and Michael Mageau, a 19-year-old friend, had driven to the park and parked in a spot near the golf course. Shortly after midnight, a car pulled up behind them and sat with its lights off for several minutes before driving away. The car returned approximately 10 minutes later and parked directly behind Ferrin's vehicle. A man stepped out, approached the driver's side window, and without a word, opened fire with a 9mm pistol, shooting both victims multiple times through the window. The assailant then walked away but returned when he heard Mageau moaning in pain and fired 2 additional shots at point-blank range before leaving the scene for good. Miraculously, Michael Mageau survived the attack despite being shot 4 times, while Darlene Ferrin died from her injuries at a local hospital. Approximately 45 minutes after the shooting, a man called the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone at a gas station and, in a calm and measured voice, stated that he was the person responsible for the shooting at Blue Rock Springs and that he had also been responsible for the Lake Herman Road murders 7 months earlier. The caller provided details about the crime scene that only the killer could have known, including the position of the victims' bodies and the weapons used. The phone call was traced, but the caller had already departed by the time officers arrived at the payphone. The conversation was brief, chilling in its matter-of-fact tone, and it marked the beginning of the killer's practice of communicating directly with law enforcement and the media, a practice that would become the defining characteristic of the Zodiac case. The third confirmed Zodiac attack occurred on the night of September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa, a sprawling recreational reservoir located in Napa County, approximately 50 miles northeast of San Francisco. Brian Hartnell, a 20-year-old college student, and Cecilia Shepard, a 22-year-old student at Pacific Union College, were picnicking on a remote stretch of the shoreline when they were approached by a man wearing a bizarre and terrifying costume. The man was dressed in a black executioner-style hood that featured a white crosshair symbol over the eyes and the bridge of the nose, a dark jacket, and a pleated skirt-like garment, and he was armed with a 12-inch hunting knife. The man claimed to be an escaped convict from a prison in Montana and said he needed their car and money to flee to Mexico. He then produced a length of clothesline and instructed Hartnell to tie up Shepard, and then the man retied Hartnell with greater force. The killer then pulled out his knife and began stabbing both victims repeatedly. Brian Hartnell survived the attack by playing dead and was able to flag down help after the killer left. Cecilia Shepard, despite being severely wounded, was conscious and able to describe the attacker to investigators before she died 2 days later at Queen of the Valley Hospital in Napa. After the attack, the killer drove to a nearby location and used a black marker to draw a crosshair symbol on the passenger door of Hartnell's car, along with the dates of the 2 previous attacks and a message that read, Vallejo, 12/20, 68, 7/4, 69, September 27, 69, by knife. The killer then called the Napa County Sheriff's Office from a payphone near the entrance to the Lake Berryessa area and reported the attack, once again providing details that only the perpetrator could have known. The Lake Berryessa attack was a watershed moment in the Zodiac case because it produced the first detailed description of the killer from a surviving victim. Brian Hartnell described the attacker as a heavy-set white male, approximately 5 feet 8 to 6 feet tall, with a deep voice that sounded as if it belonged to an older man, possibly in his 30s or 40s. The crosshair symbol that the killer drew on the car door would become his permanent signature, the emblem by which he would be known to the world. The fourth confirmed attack, and the only one to occur within the city limits of San Francisco, took place on the night of October 11, 1969. Paul Stein, a 29-year-old taxi driver, picked up a passenger at the intersection of Mason and Geary Streets in downtown San Francisco and drove to the affluent Presidio Heights neighborhood, where the passenger directed him to stop on Washington Street, a quiet residential block lined with large homes and mature trees. The passenger then pulled out a 9mm pistol and shot Stein once in the head at point-blank range, killing him instantly. The killer then reached across Stein's body, tore a large piece of his shirt from the lower hem, and wiped down the interior of the taxi to remove fingerprints. The killer exited the vehicle and was seen by 3 teenagers who were sitting in a second-floor window of a house directly across the street. The witnesses observed a man calmly walking away from the taxi, and they noted that he appeared to be a white male with a crew cut, wearing a dark jacket and dark pants. One of the teenagers called the police to report the shooting, and a dispatch was sent out describing a suspect matching the teenager's description. Tragically, the dispatch incorrectly described the suspect as a Negro male, a racial miscategorization that caused responding officers to stop and question two African American men who were walking in the area while the actual killer, who was white, was able to walk away from the scene unimpeded. The killer had also written a message on the taxi's divider with a piece of Stein's shirt, directing it to the San Francisco Police Department. The message read that the shooter intended to kill a police officer the following night, and it included the crosshair symbol. A piece of Stein's bloody shirt was included with the message, a chilling calling card that confirmed the killer's identity. The murder of Paul Stein elevated the Zodiac case from a regional serial killer investigation to a full-scale law enforcement crisis, and the San Francisco Police Department assigned significant resources to the manhunt. But the Zodiac was not content simply to kill. What made the Zodiac unique among serial killers was his obsessive need to communicate with the public and to taunt the authorities through a series of elaborate letters and cryptograms that he sent to newspapers in the San Francisco Bay Area. Beginning in August 1969, just weeks after the Blue Rock Springs attack, the Zodiac sent a three-part cipher to the San Francisco Examiner, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter contained one-third of a coded message, and the killer demanded that the newspapers publish the ciphers on their front pages or he would go on a rampage and kill a dozen people over the following weekend. The newspapers complied, and a schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty, working from their home in Salinas, cracked the cipher within a week. The decoded message revealed a rambling and disturbing statement in which the killer claimed to be collecting slaves for the afterlife, declared that he would not give his identity because it would slow down or stop his collection of slaves, and stated that he enjoyed killing people because it was more fun than killing wild animals in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. Over the following months and years, the Zodiac sent at least 18 additional letters to newspapers, television stations, and law enforcement agencies, each containing a mix of boasts about his crimes, threats of future violence, bizarre philosophical musings, and additional ciphers that were never solved. One letter, sent in November 1969, included a detailed diagram of a bomb that the killer claimed he was going to use to blow up a school bus. The threat prompted school districts across the Bay Area to implement armed guards on school buses for several weeks, a massive disruption to daily life that demonstrated the killer's ability to instill fear on a societal scale. Another cipher, known as the Z-32 cipher, was sent in 1970 and appeared to contain information about the killer's identity and his plans for future attacks. Despite being analyzed by the National Security Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, and countless amateur and professional codebreakers over the decades, the Z-32 cipher was not solved until December 2020, when an international team of cryptographers finally cracked it using specialized software. The decoded message revealed a threatening but ultimately uninformative statement about the killer's intentions, and it did not contain a definitive identification. The investigation into the Zodiac murders was one of the largest and most complex in California history, involving multiple law enforcement agencies including the Vallejo Police Department, the Napa County Sheriff's Office, and the San Francisco Police Department, each of which pursued its own leads and developed its own theories. The lack of coordination between these agencies, combined with the limitations of forensic science at the time, hampered the investigation from the outset. Numerous suspects were investigated over the years, but none were ever charged with the Zodiac crimes. Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester and former schoolteacher who lived in Vallejo, was considered the primary suspect for decades. Allen bore a physical resemblance to descriptions of the Zodiac, had access to the types of weapons used in the crimes, and had made statements to acquaintances that seemed to implicate himself in the murders. However, Allen's fingerprints did not match those found at any of the crime scenes, his handwriting did not match the Zodiac letters, and a search of his home turned up no physical evidence connecting him to the killings. Allen was never charged and died of a heart attack in 1992. Other suspects have included a mentally ill man named Richard Gajkowski, a former postal worker who was identified by a surviving victim as resembling the killer, and a man named Lawrence Kane, who was investigated based on behavioral analysis and circumstantial connections to the case. None of these suspects have been definitively linked to the crimes. In 2021, a team of civilian investigators claimed to have identified the Zodiac as Gary Francis Post, a man who had lived in the Sierra Nevada foothills and who had died in 2018. The team pointed to alleged forensic evidence, including a scar on Post's forehead that matched a description provided by a witness, and to DNA evidence that they claimed connected Post to a stamp on a Zodiac letter. However, the claims have been met with intense skepticism from law enforcement and from established Zodiac researchers, who have pointed out significant flaws in the team's methodology and a lack of peer-reviewed scientific support for their conclusions. The FBI and the San Francisco Police Department have stated that the case remains open and that no definitive identification has been made. The Zodiac case has had a profound and enduring impact on American culture and on the field of criminal investigation. The killer's use of cryptograms and media communication was unprecedented and established a template that subsequent serial killers, including the BTK killer and the Unabomber, would follow. The case exposed the vulnerabilities of a fragmented law enforcement system and demonstrated the power of a single individual to terrorize an entire region through the manipulation of media and public fear. Numerous books, films, and television programs have been produced about the Zodiac case, most notably David Fincher's 2007 film Zodiac, which brought the case to a new generation of audiences and reignited public interest in the mystery. The crosshair symbol that the killer adopted as his signature has become one of the most recognizable icons in the true crime genre, a simple geometric design that evokes a complex web of murder, cryptography, and psychological manipulation. More than 55 years after the first murder on Lake Herman Road, the identity of the Zodiac killer remains unknown, and the case stands as one of the most frustrating and compelling unsolved mysteries in the history of American criminal justice. The killer, whoever he was, achieved a terrible and perverse form of immortality, embedding himself in the collective consciousness of a nation and ensuring that his crimes would be remembered and debated long after the blood had been washed from the pavement and the letters had yellowed in the archives. For the families of the victims, the absence of closure is a permanent and painful reality, a void that no amount of media attention or amateur investigation can fill. The Zodiac promised in his letters that he would never be caught, and as of this day, that promise has been kept. Number 6, the Oakland County Child Killer. Between February of 1976 and March of 1977, the affluent suburban communities of Oakland County, Michigan, which lie just north of the city of Detroit, were gripped by a terror that no amount of wealth, security systems, or neighborhood watch programs could dispel. A serial predator was hunting children, abducting them from public spaces in broad daylight, holding them captive for periods ranging from several days to nearly 3 weeks, and then murdering them and leaving their carefully cleaned bodies on snowy roadsides and in drainage ditches in a pattern that suggested a chilling level of planning, control, and ritualistic behavior. The case, which became known as the Oakland County Child Killer Investigation, or simply the OCCK case, would eventually claim the lives of at least 4 young people, though many researchers and investigators believe the true number of victims may be higher, and it would become the most notorious and frustrating unsolved serial murder case in the history of the state of Michigan. The first victim was Mark Stebbins, a 12-year-old boy from the city of Ferndale, a modest middle-class community within Oakland County. On February 15, 1976, a Saturday afternoon, Mark left his home on foot to go to the nearby American Legion Hall, where his older brother was attending a meeting. When Mark did not return home by evening, his family became alarmed and reported him missing to the Ferndale Police Department. An initial search of the area turned up nothing, and Mark's disappearance was initially treated as a possible runaway case, a characterization that would later be fiercely criticized as a failure of law enforcement to recognize the gravity of the situation. 4 days later, on February 19, a construction worker discovered Mark's body lying in a snowbank on the side of a rural road in the nearby community of Southfield. The boy was fully clothed and had been placed on his back with his hands neatly arranged at his sides. An autopsy revealed that Mark had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The medical examiner also noted that Mark had been fed a meal shortly before his death, likely consisting of fried chicken, based on the contents of his stomach. The fact that the boy had been held alive for approximately 4 days before being killed suggested that the kidnapper had a secure location where he could keep a child without being detected, a detail that deeply unsettled investigators and the public alike. The second victim was Jill Robinson, a 12-year-old girl from the city of Royal Oak, another Oakland County suburb. Jill had a troubled home life and had argued with her mother on the evening of March 22, 1976, before running away from home on her bicycle. She was last seen at a local gas station, where she was reportedly asking for directions. Her bicycle was found abandoned nearby. 6 days later, on March 26, Jill's body was discovered by a passerby lying in a drainage ditch on the side of a road in the community of Troy, approximately 10 miles from where she was last seen. Like Mark Stebbins, Jill was fully clothed and had been carefully positioned on her back. She had been shot once in the face with a 12-gauge shotgun, a method of killing that differed significantly from the strangulation used in the Stebbins case, a discrepancy that initially led some investigators to question whether the two murders were connected. However, the careful staging of the body and the grooming of the victim suggested a similar offender, and the cases were eventually linked. The third victim was Christine Mihalik, a 10-year-old girl from the affluent community of Berkeley. On January 2, 1977, Christine walked to a nearby convenience store to buy a magazine and was seen leaving the store at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon. She never arrived home. Her body was found on January 21, 19 days after her disappearance, on the side of a rural road in the community of Franklin, wrapped in a snow-covered blanket. Like the previous victims, Christine was fully clothed and had been carefully positioned. She had been smothered to death, and an examination of her stomach contents revealed that she had been fed a meal of fried chicken and French fries shortly before her death, a detail that echoed the finding in the Mark Stebbins case and strongly suggested a connection between the two murders. The fourth confirmed victim was Timothy King, an 11-year-old boy from the wealthy suburb of Birmingham. On March 16, 1977, Timothy left his home on his bicycle to go to a local drugstore to buy candy. He was last seen at approximately 8:30 in the evening, speaking to a man in a parking lot near the drugstore. A massive search was launched immediately, involving hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement officers, but Timothy was not found alive. On March 22, 6 days after his disappearance, Timothy's body was discovered in a shallow drainage ditch in the community of Livonia, which is located in neighboring Wayne County, just outside the boundaries of Oakland County. Timothy was wearing the same clothes he had been wearing when he disappeared, minus his jacket and one of his shoes, and his body had been carefully positioned on its back. He had been smothered to death, and a subsequent autopsy revealed that he had been sexually assaulted and that his stomach contained fragments of fried chicken, establishing what investigators now recognized as a definitive signature of the killer. The discovery of Timothy King's body triggered an explosion of public outrage and fear that was unprecedented in the history of the region. Parents in Oakland County and throughout the metropolitan Detroit area were terrified to let their children out of their sight, and the atmosphere in the normally tranquil suburban communities became one of near hysteria. The sheer brazenness of the abductions, which had occurred in broad daylight in busy public areas, and the prolonged captivity of the victims, which suggested a level of premeditation and logistical planning that was both sophisticated and deeply disturbing, convinced the public that they were dealing with a predator of extraordinary cunning and danger. In response to the crisis, a multi-agency task force was assembled, comprising investigators from the Michigan State Police, the FBI, and the police departments of every community in Oakland County. The task force, which eventually grew to include more than 100 officers, was one of the largest and most expensive law enforcement operations in Michigan history. The investigation generated tens of thousands of tips, conducted thousands of interviews, and pursued hundreds of suspects, but it was plagued from the beginning by jurisdictional rivalries, communication failures, and a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the offender. Some investigators believed the killer was a local resident who was intimately familiar with the Oakland County area and who had access to a secure location, possibly a basement or an outbuilding, where he could hold children captive without being detected. Others argued that the killer was an outsider, possibly a transient or a long-haul trucker, who was drawn to the affluent suburbs by the opportunity to prey on children who were less closely supervised than children in urban areas. The task force focused considerable attention on several suspects over the years. One of the most prominent was a man named Christopher Bush, the son of a wealthy and politically connected General Motors executive. Bush had a history of mental illness and had been implicated in multiple child sexual assault cases in the 1970s, but he had never been prosecuted, allegedly because of his family's influence. Bush was brought to the attention of the task force by a polygraph examiner who had administered a polygraph test to Bush in connection with an unrelated child sexual assault case and had become convinced that Bush was involved in the Oakland County murders. In November 1978, Bush was found dead in his home in the affluent community of Bloomfield Hills, the victim of an apparent suicide by a single gunshot wound to the head. His death effectively closed one avenue of investigation. But it also fueled persistent rumors of a cover-up and a conspiracy to protect a wealthy and connected family. In 2006, the case was reopened by the Oakland County Prosecutor's Office, and new DNA testing was conducted on evidence recovered from the victims. In 2010, a DNA profile was developed from evidence found on the body of Christine Mihalik, and the profile was compared to DNA samples from numerous suspects, including Christopher Bush, but no match was found. Another suspect who received significant scrutiny was a man named James Vincent Gunnels, who had been a victim of Christopher Bush and who had been present in Bush's home on occasions when other children were present. Gunnels was interviewed multiple times by investigators but was never charged. In 2018, the Michigan State Police announced that they had identified a person of interest in the case through the use of advanced DNA technology, but they declined to name the individual publicly, stating that the investigation was ongoing. As of the present, no arrest has been made in connection with the Oakland County child killer murders, and the case remains officially unsolved. The failure to solve the OCCK case has had a profound and lasting impact on the families of the victims and on the communities of Oakland County. The parents of the 4 murdered children have spent decades fighting for answers, lobbying law enforcement agencies to keep the investigation active, and pushing for the release of documents and evidence that they believe have been improperly withheld. They have formed advocacy groups, testified before state legislative committees, and filed civil lawsuits against law enforcement agencies, arguing that the investigation was compromised by incompetence, corruption, and a deliberate effort to protect powerful individuals. The case has also had a significant impact on the field of child safety and missing persons investigation. The abductions in Oakland County were among the first cases to receive widespread national media attention in the era before the creation of organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and they helped to catalyze a national conversation about the vulnerability of children in suburban communities and the need for improved coordination between law enforcement agencies in cases involving abducted children. The Oakland County child killer case remains one of the most haunting and disturbing unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. The image of 4 children, abducted from the safety of their neighborhoods, held captive in the dark, fed their last meals of fried chicken, and then murdered and left in the snow, is a vision of evil that defies comprehension. The killer, whoever he was, constructed a scenario of such deliberate cruelty and psychological terror that it transcends the boundaries of ordinary criminal behavior and enters the realm of the genuinely monstrous. For the people of Oakland County, the case is a scar that has never fully healed, a reminder that behind the manicured lawns and the prosperous facades of suburban life, there are mysteries that can destroy everything, and that justice, no matter how desperately it is sought, is not always within reach. Number 7, the murder of Sheila Vaughn Wismak, the tropical paradise of Bali, Indonesia, with its lush rice terraces, ancient Hindu temples, and turquoise waters, draws millions of international tourists each year seeking relaxation, spiritual renewal, and escape from the pressures of daily life. Among the travelers who arrived on the island in August of 2014 was a 52-year-old woman named Sheila Vaughn Wismak, a resident of the affluent North Shore suburb of Oak Park, Illinois, a quiet and tree-lined community just west of Chicago known for its architecturally significant homes and its atmosphere of settled prosperity. Sheila was the widow of classical music composer David Mack, and she lived in a comfortable home filled with artwork and mementos of a life that had, for many years, been closely tied to the cultural world of Chicago. By 2014, however, Sheila's life had become increasingly complicated and troubled, largely because of her deeply fractured relationship with her only child, a 19-year-old daughter named Heather Mack. The relationship between Sheila and Heather had been deteriorating for years, marked by episodes of intense conflict, allegations of physical violence, and interventions by law enforcement and mental health professionals. In 2010, when Heather was 15 years old, Sheila had called the police to their home to report that Heather had physically assaulted her, an incident that resulted in Heather being placed in a psychiatric facility for evaluation. In 2013, another altercation between the two had resulted in a police response and Heather's brief detention. Despite these incidents, the underlying bond between mother and daughter, however damaged and dysfunctional, persisted, and the two continued to live together in the Oak Park home, locked in a cycle of conflict and temporary reconciliation that showed no signs of permanent resolution. In the summer of 2014, Sheila and Heather decided to take a vacation together to Bali, a trip that was ostensibly intended as a mother-daughter bonding experience and a chance to repair their fractured relationship. They booked a stay at the prestigious St. Regis Bali Resort, a 5-star luxury hotel located on the southern coast of the island in the area of Nusa Dua, a gated enclave of high-end resorts that catered to an international clientele of wealthy tourists and business executives. The St. Regis was known for its white sand beaches, its world-class spa, its multiple swimming pools, and its butler service, and a stay there represented a significant financial investment, reflecting the comfortable economic circumstances of the Von Wiesmack household. Joining Sheila and Heather on the trip was Heather's boyfriend, Tommy Schaefer, a 21-year-old man from Chicago whom Heather had been dating for a relatively short period. Schaefer was a bodybuilder and a self-described personal trainer who had a reputation in his social circle for being domineering and prone to anger. Sheila reportedly disapproved of Schaefer and had expressed reservations about him to friends and family members before the trip, but Heather had insisted that he be allowed to join them, and Sheila, perhaps in an effort to avoid another explosive confrontation with her daughter, had reluctantly agreed. The trio arrived in Bali on August 4, 2014, and checked into the St. Regis, where they were assigned a ground-floor room in the hotel's main building. Over the following days, hotel staff and other guests would later report observing tense interactions between Sheila and Heather, including arguments in the hotel lobby and at the restaurant, suggesting that the hoped-for reconciliation was not materializing. On the evening of August 12, Sheila was seen dining at the hotel's restaurant, apparently alone, while Heather and Schaefer were elsewhere on the resort grounds. This would be the last time Sheila Von Wiesmack was seen alive by anyone who could later provide an account to investigators. The following morning, on August 13, the housekeeping staff at the St. Regis discovered a large, dark-colored suitcase sitting on the pavement outside the hotel, near the entrance to the lobby area. The suitcase was a hardshell Samsonite model, and it was large enough to contain an adult human body, a fact that would soon become horrifyingly relevant. When hotel security staff examined the suitcase, they noticed a dark, foul-smelling liquid seeping from its seams and pooling on the pavement beneath it. The staff opened the suitcase and discovered the battered body of Sheila Von Wiesmack, stuffed inside in a fetal position. The scene was grotesque and immediately triggered a massive response from hotel security and local Indonesian police. Sheila's body was covered in bruises and abrasions, and a preliminary examination indicated that she had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head and face. The murder weapon was never definitively identified, but investigators believed it was a heavy object, possibly a hotel room amenity such as a decorative bottle or a piece of furniture. An autopsy conducted by Indonesian forensic pathologists concluded that Sheila had died from asphyxiation combined with blunt force trauma, and that the injuries to her face were so severe that they had caused significant deformation. The investigation moved quickly, as Indonesian authorities were acutely aware of the potential damage that a high-profile murder of a foreign tourist could inflict on the country's vital tourism industry. Surveillance footage from the St. Regis was reviewed, and it revealed critical evidence. The footage showed Tommy Schaefer and Heather Mack loading the suitcase containing Sheila's body onto a luggage cart and pushing it through the hotel lobby and out to the entrance, where they left it. The footage captured the two individuals acting in a manner that appeared calm and deliberate, with no visible signs of panic or distress, a detail that prosecutors would later emphasize as evidence of premeditation. Heather and Tommy had checked out of the hotel shortly after leaving the suitcase and had taken a taxi to another hotel in the nearby area of Kuta, a beach town known for its nightlife and backpacker culture. Indonesian police arrested Tommy Schaefer at the nearby hotel on August 14, approximately 24 hours after the body was discovered. Heather Mack was also taken into custody at the same location. During police interrogation, both suspects provided accounts of the events of the previous night that were self-serving, inconsistent, and demonstrably false. Schaefer initially claimed that he had not been in Sheila's room on the night of the murder and that he had no knowledge of how she died. Under sustained questioning, however, his story began to unravel. He eventually admitted that he had been in Sheila's room and that an argument had taken place, but he claimed that Sheila had attacked him first and that he had acted in self-defense. He denied killing her and suggested that someone else must have entered the room and committed the murder while he was temporarily absent. Heather Mack's account was equally evasive. She initially told police that she had been asleep in the room during the time of the murder and that she had woken up to find her mother dead. She claimed that Schaefer had then told her that they needed to hide the body and that she had assisted him in placing Sheila in the suitcase out of fear. She denied any involvement in the actual killing. The Indonesian legal system, which is based on a civil law framework derived from Dutch colonial law and differs significantly from the common law system used in the United States, presented unique challenges for the prosecution and for the American defendants. In Indonesia, criminal cases are tried by a panel of judges rather than a jury, the rules of evidence are less formalized, and the burden of proof, while technically on the prosecution, operates within a system where judges actively question witnesses and defendants and play a much more assertive role in the proceedings than a typical American judge would. The trial of Tommy Schaefer and Heather Mack took place in the Denpasar District Court in Bali in early 2015, and it attracted intense media attention from both the Indonesian press and the international media, including extensive coverage from American news outlets. The prosecution presented a case based largely on circumstantial evidence, surveillance footage, and the inconsistent statements of the defendants. The central forensic question in the case, and the question that makes the Sheila von Wijsmack murder a particularly baffling mystery, was the identity of the person who actually delivered the fatal blows. The Indonesian forensic pathologists who conducted the autopsy were not able to determine definitively whether the fatal injuries had been inflicted by Tommy Schaefer, by Heather Mack, or by both of them acting in concert. The severity of the injuries suggested a significant disparity in physical strength between the attacker and the victim, which pointed toward Schaefer, who was a large and muscular man, as the most likely assailant. However, the forensic evidence could not rule out the possibility that Heather, who was considerably smaller than her mother, had participated in the attack or had struck the fatal blow while Sheila was already incapacitated. The prosecution argued that the murder was a premeditated act driven by financial motive, pointing to evidence that Sheila had a significant estate, including the Oak Park home and life insurance policies, and that Heather stood to inherit a substantial sum of money upon her mother's death. The prosecution also highlighted the history of conflict between mother and daughter and suggested that the Bali trip had been planned, at least in part, as an opportunity to carry out the murder in a jurisdiction where the legal consequences might be less severe than in the United States, a theory that was speculative but resonated with the court. In April 2015, Tommy Schaefer was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Sheila von Wijsmack and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Heather Mack was found guilty of being an accessory to murder and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The difference in the charges and sentences reflected the court's assessment of the respective roles of the two defendants, with Schaefer being viewed as the primary perpetrator and Mack as a secondary participant who had assisted in the cover-up. Both defendants appealed their convictions, but the Indonesian appellate court upheld the verdicts. Heather Mack gave birth to a son while in prison in Bali, and the child was initially raised within the prison facility before being relocated to the United States to live with family members. In 2021, both Schaefer and Mack were deported to the United States after completing their prison sentences in Indonesia, having been granted early release as part of a program to reduce prison overcrowding during the COVID-19 pandemic. Upon their return to the United States, both were immediately taken into custody by federal authorities to face additional charges related to the case. In 2023, Heather Mack pleaded guilty in a federal court in Chicago to a charge of conspiring to kill her mother in a foreign country, acknowledging for the first time in an American court that she had played a deliberate role in planning the murder. She was sentenced to 26 years in federal prison. Tommy Schaefer also faced federal charges and was subsequently convicted and sentenced. Despite these convictions, the fundamental mystery at the heart of the Sheila Vaughn Wiesmack case remains unresolved. The question of who exactly struck the blows that ended Sheila's life in that hotel room in Bali has never been answered with forensic certainty. Tommy Schaefer has maintained, through his attorneys, that Heather was more involved in the actual killing than she has admitted, a claim that Heather has vehemently denied. The Indonesian forensic evidence, while strongly suggestive of Schaefer's primary role, does not provide the kind of definitive, unambiguous proof that would close the forensic gap. The suitcase itself, which was handled by both defendants and left in a public area, was contaminated as a crime scene, and no usable DNA or fingerprint evidence from the interior of the suitcase could be definitively linked to either defendant in a way that proved who placed Sheila inside it. For the family and friends of Sheila Vaughn Wiesmack, the convictions of Schaefer and Mack provided a measure of accountability but not a complete resolution. The image of a mother being beaten to death in a luxury hotel room on the other side of the world, stuffed into a suitcase by her own daughter and her daughter's boyfriend, and left to be found seeping blood onto a tropical sidewalk, is a vision of cruelty that defies easy understanding. The legal proceedings in Indonesia and the United States, while resulting in significant prison sentences, never fully illuminated the precise sequence of events in that hotel room, the exact distribution of culpability between the two defendants, or the depths of the hatred and dysfunction that drove a 19-year-old girl to participate in the murder of her own mother. The murder of Sheila Vaughn Wiesmack remains a case where justice was partially served, but the complete truth, the granular, forensic, unambiguous truth of who did what to whom in those final moments, remains hidden behind a wall of lies, contaminated evidence, and the irreducible mystery of human wickedness. Number 8. The disappearance of Kristen Smart. On the evening of May 25, 1996, the campus of California Polytechnic State University, commonly known as Cal Poly, in the city of San Luis Obispo, California, was alive with the energy and excitement that typically accompanies the end of the academic year. Students were celebrating the completion of finals, packing up their dormitory rooms, and saying goodbye to friends before heading home for the summer. Among the students participating in the end-of-year festivities was a 19-year-old freshman named Kristen Smart, a cheerful and outgoing young woman from the small Northern California community of Stockton who had come to Cal Poly to study archaeology and who was known among her friends for her bright smile, her love of the outdoors, and her genuine kindness toward others. Kristen had spent the evening of May 25 at an off-campus party at a house located on Crandall Way, a residential street near the university that was a popular gathering spot for students. The party was a typical college gathering, with music, conversation, and the consumption of alcohol by many of the attendees, including Kristen, who was reportedly intoxicated by the time she decided to leave. At approximately 1:45 in the morning on May 26, Kristen was preparing to walk back to her dormitory, a distance of approximately 1 mile from the party location. Several of her friends noticed that she was in no condition to walk alone and attempted to persuade her to stay at the party or to let someone drive her back to campus. However, a fellow student named Paul Flores, who was also at the party, offered to walk Kristen back to her dormitory, and Kristen accepted his offer. Paul Flores, also a freshman at Cal Poly, was not a close friend of Kristen's, but he lived in the same dormitory complex, a cluster of residence halls known as the Santa Lucia Halls, and his offer to escort her appeared to be a gesture of basic campus courtesy. This was the last time Kristen Smart was seen alive by anyone who could provide a confirmed account of her whereabouts. When Kristen did not return to her dormitory room that night and did not appear the following morning, her roommate and her friends became increasingly concerned. Kristen was a responsible young woman who was not in the habit of disappearing without notifying anyone, and her failure to return was completely out of character. Her friends reported her missing to the Cal Poly campus police on May 27, approximately 24 hours after she was last seen. The initial response by the campus police was, in retrospect, critically inadequate. For the first several days, the department treated Kristen's disappearance as a possible case of a student who had overstayed a weekend visit with friends or who had simply decided to extend her vacation without telling anyone. No immediate search of the campus was conducted, no roadblocks were set up, and the critical first hours and days, which are universally recognized by law enforcement as the most important window for locating a missing person, were allowed to pass without the kind of urgent and aggressive investigation that the situation demanded. It was not until Kristen's parents, Stan and Denise Smart, traveled from Stockton to San Luis Obispo and personally pressured the campus police and the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office to take the case seriously that a full-scale missing persons investigation was launched. By that point, however, more than a week had elapsed since Kristen's disappearance, and any physical evidence that might have existed at the party location, along the route between the party and the dormitory, or in the dormitory itself had been degraded, destroyed, or rendered useless by the passage of time and the normal activity of a college campus. The investigation quickly focused on Paul Flores, who had been the last person seen with Kristen and who was the only individual known to have been in her company during the critical period between her departure from the party and her expected arrival at the dormitory. When investigators interviewed Flores, his account of the walk back to campus was vague, evasive, and internally inconsistent. He told police that he had walked Kristen to the entrance of the Santa Lucia dormitory complex and that they had parted ways there, with Kristen proceeding to her specific dormitory building and Flores continuing to his own room in a different building within the same complex. He claimed that he had not entered Kristen's building and that he had not seen her after they separated at the entrance. However, other students who lived in the Santa Lucia complex reported hearing screams or other disturbing noises coming from the area near the dormitories on the night of Kristen's disappearance, and Flores himself, when interviewed by a campus counselor a few days after the disappearance, reportedly made statements that were interpreted by the counselor as indicative of someone who was concealing information about a traumatic event. When investigators attempted to interview Flores a second time, he retained an attorney and refused to answer any further questions. Despite the strong circumstantial evidence pointing to Flores as the person most likely responsible for Kristen's disappearance, the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office was unable to build a criminal case against him in the late 1990s. The absence of a body, the absence of any physical evidence directly linking Flores to a crime, and the absence of any witnesses who could place Flores with Kristen at the moment of her alleged abduction or murder meant that the threshold for filing criminal charges was not met. The case went cold, and Kristen Smart's name was added to the growing list of missing persons in California, a list that seemed to grow longer with each passing year. For the Smart family, the years following Kristen's disappearance were a living nightmare of uncertainty, grief, and frustration. Stan and Denise Smart became tireless advocates for their daughter, appearing on national television programs, lobbying state legislators for changes in the way missing persons cases were handled, and working with organizations dedicated to finding missing children. They never gave up hope that Kristen would be found alive, but as the years turned into decades, that hope became increasingly difficult to sustain. The case received periodic media attention, and each new wave of publicity generated new tips and leads, but none of them led to a definitive breakthrough. The turning point in the case came more than 2 decades after Kristen's disappearance, when a combination of new investigative techniques, new witnesses, and a determined new team of prosecutors finally broke the logjam that had prevented justice from being served. In 2019, the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office, now under new leadership, announced that it was reopening the investigation into Kristen Smart's disappearance with a renewed focus on Paul Flores. A team of investigators, working in conjunction with the FBI, began re-interviewing witnesses, re-examining old evidence, and pursuing new leads that had not been fully explored in the original investigation. A critical development came when investigators were able to identify and interview several individuals who had lived in the Santa Lucia dormitories at the time of Kristen's disappearance and who had not been thoroughly interviewed in 1996. These witnesses provided new and significant information about Paul Flores's behavior in the days and weeks following Kristen's disappearance. According to these witnesses, Flores had exhibited a number of behaviors that were consistent with someone who had committed a violent crime and was attempting to conceal it. One witness reported that Flores had asked for help cleaning a stain out of a carpet in his dormitory room shortly after Kristen's disappearance. Another witness reported that Flores had been seen with what appeared to be a large, heavy object wrapped in a blanket, which he was carrying in the direction of his car in the dormitory parking lot. Still another witness reported that Flores had made statements to acquaintances suggesting that he knew what had happened to Kristen and that she would never be found. In 2020, investigators executed a search warrant at a home in Arroyo Grande, California, where Paul Flores had been living with his mother, Ruben Flores. The search warrant was based on newly developed evidence, including ground-penetrating radar surveys of the property that had detected anomalies beneath a concrete slab on the rear deck of the house. During the search, investigators excavated a section of the concrete slab and the soil beneath it and discovered what they described as biological evidence, including soil that contained traces of human blood. The evidence was submitted for DNA analysis, and while the results were not definitive enough to positively identify Kristen Smart, they were consistent with the presence of human remains having been buried at the location at some point in the past. On April 13, 2021, Paul Flores was arrested and charged with the murder of Kristen Smart. His father, Ruben Flores, was arrested and charged with being an accessory to the crime, specifically with helping his son conceal Kristen's body by burying it beneath the concrete slab at the Arroyo Grande property and later removing the remains to an unknown location. The arrests were the culmination of a 25-year investigation and were met with an outpouring of emotion from the Smart family, from the Cal Poly community, and from the public, who had followed the case for decades. The trial of Paul Flores began in 2022 in a San Luis Obispo County courtroom and was one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in California history. The prosecution presented a circumstantial case that was built layer by layer, brick by brick, like a wall constructed from fragments of evidence, each fragment insufficient on its own but together forming an overwhelming edifice of guilt. The prosecution's theory was that Paul Flores had attacked and killed Kristen Smart, either on the walk back to the dormitory or inside his dormitory room, and that he had then concealed her body, initially on the Cal Poly campus and later at the Arroyo Grande property, with the assistance of his father. The defense argued that the prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial, that there was no direct evidence that Paul Flores had killed Kristen, and that the biological evidence recovered from the Arroyo Grande property was inconclusive and could have come from any number of sources. After a trial that lasted several weeks, the jury deliberated for a relatively short period of time before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. Paul Flores was sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison. Ruben Flores was tried separately and was acquitted of the accessory charge, a verdict that was met with disappointment by prosecutors and the Smart family but that reflected the high burden of proof required for criminal convictions. Despite the conviction of Paul Flores, the disappearance of Kristen Smart remains, in one critical and agonizing respect, an unsolved mystery. Kristen's body has never been found. The prosecution was able to secure a murder conviction without a body, a legal outcome that is possible under California law but that is relatively rare and requires a particularly strong circumstantial case. The absence of Kristen's remains means that the precise circumstances of her death, including the cause of death, the location of the killing, and the timeline of events on the night of May 25 and 26, 1996, have never been established with forensic certainty. The question of where Paul Flores hid Kristen's body in the 25 years between her disappearance and his arrest, and whether the remains were ultimately moved to a permanent location or destroyed, remains unanswered. For the Smart family, the conviction of Paul Flores brought a measure of justice and accountability that they had fought for a quarter of a century, but it did not bring them the one thing they wanted most, the return of their daughter's remains so that she could be given a proper burial. The Kristen Smart case had a profound impact on the way colleges and universities in California and across the United States handle reports of missing students. The failures of the initial investigation at Cal Poly, including the delay in treating Kristen's disappearance as a potential crime, the failure to promptly interview key witnesses, and the failure to secure physical evidence in a timely manner, became a case study in what not to do when a student goes missing. In the years following Kristen's disappearance, California and several other states passed legislation requiring colleges and universities to enter into memoranda of understanding with local law enforcement agencies that established clear protocols for the immediate and coordinated response to reports of missing students. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving crime scenes and physical evidence in missing persons cases, even when there is no immediate indication that a crime has been committed. Cal Poly itself implemented significant changes to its campus safety procedures, including the installation of additional lighting and security cameras, the expansion of its campus police force, and the creation of a more robust system for tracking and responding to reports of missing students. Kristen Smart's name is now memorialized on the Cal Poly campus, and her story is told to every incoming class of freshmen as a reminder of the importance of looking out for one another and of taking every report of a missing person seriously. The conviction of Paul Flores stands as a testament to the power of persistence, to the refusal of a family to accept defeat, and to the capacity of the criminal justice system, however imperfect and slow, to eventually deliver a result. But the missing body of Kristen Smart is a void at the center of the story, a silent and permanent reminder that even when the system works, even when a murderer is brought to justice, some questions remain forever beyond the reach of human answers, buried somewhere in the earth, waiting to be found. Number 9, the Long Island Serial Killer, also known as the Gilgo Beach Killer. The stretch of Ocean Parkway that runs along the southern coast of Long Island, New York, is a narrow ribbon of asphalt that separates the rolling dunes and the crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean from the dense thickets of scrub pine and oak that make up the vast, desolate wilderness area known as the Pine Barrens. During the summer months, this road is a busy thoroughfare that carries thousands of beachgoers to the sandy shores of Jones Beach State Park and the nearby communities of Babylon, Islip, and Brookhaven. But during the winter, when the wind howls off the ocean and the temperature drops below freezing, Ocean Parkway becomes a lonely and forbidding corridor, flanked by an impenetrable wall of vegetation that extends for miles in every direction, a landscape that feels less like the suburbs of New York City and more like the edge of the known world. It was into this desolate winter landscape that one of the most prolific and baffling serial killers in American history would deposit the remains of his victims, transforming a 13-mile stretch of beach highway into one of the largest and most disturbing crime scenes in the history of American law enforcement. The discovery that would ultimately unveil the Long Island serial killer case began not as a murder investigation but as a missing persons search. In May of 2010, a 24-year-old woman named Shannon Gilbert, who worked as an escort and advertised her services on Craigslist, was hired by a client to travel to a gated community in the affluent Long Island hamlet of Oak Beach, a small cluster of waterfront homes located just off Ocean Parkway. Shannon arrived at the client's home in the early morning hours of May 1st, and what happened next remains a subject of intense dispute and speculation. The client, a man named Joseph Brewer, called 911 at approximately 4:45 in the morning to report that a woman who had been at his home was behaving erratically and had fled into the night without her shoes or her cell phone. A driver who had transported Shannon to Oak Beach later told police that Shannon had knocked on his car window in a state of extreme panic, screaming that someone was trying to kill her, before running into the marshes behind the houses. An extensive search of the Oak Beach area by police and volunteers failed to locate Shannon, and she was listed as a missing person. In the course of the search for Shannon Gilbert, the Suffolk County Police Department deployed a helicopter equipped with aerial surveillance equipment to scan the dense brush along the barrier islands adjacent to Ocean Parkway. On December 11, 2010, 7 months after Shannon's disappearance, the aerial search yielded a horrific and unexpected discovery. A police officer spotted what appeared to be human remains in a thicket of phragmites, a type of tall reed that grows densely along the marshy edges of the barrier islands. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found the skeletal remains of a woman who had been wrapped in a burlap sack and left in the brush just 15 feet from the paved road. The location was on a narrow strip of land between Ocean Parkway and the ocean, near the community of Gilgo Beach, within the jurisdiction of the Suffolk County Police Department. 4 days later, on December 15, a search of the immediate area by a team of police officers and cadaver dogs uncovered 3 additional sets of human remains, all of them wrapped in burlap sacks and deposited in the brush within a short distance of the first discovery. All 4 of the victims were women, and all 4 had been identified through dental records and DNA analysis as individuals who had worked as escorts and had advertised their services on Craigslist. The first victim identified was Melissa Barthelemy, a 24-year-old woman from the Buffalo, New York, area who had gone missing in July of 2009. The second was Amber Costello, a 27-year-old woman from North Babylon, Long Island, who had disappeared in September of 2010. The third was Megan Waterman, a 22-year-old woman from Scarborough, Maine, who had gone missing in June of 2010. The fourth was Maureen Brainerd Barnes, a 25-year-old woman from Norwich, Connecticut, who had been missing since July of 2007. The discovery of these 4 bodies, all of them young women, all of them involved in sex work, all of them advertised on the same website, and all of them disposed of in the same manner and in the same location, left no doubt in the minds of investigators that they were dealing with a serial killer of extraordinary dangerousness and operational sophistication. The killer had not only murdered these women but had transported their bodies across significant distances, as the victims had disappeared from locations across the northeastern United States, and had deposited them in a remote and carefully chosen location that was accessible by vehicle but shielded from view by dense vegetation, a location that suggested an intimate familiarity with the geography of the Long Island Barrier Islands. Over the following months and years, the search area along Ocean Parkway was expanded dramatically, and additional sets of human remains were discovered, turning a 13-mile stretch of roadway into a massive and complex crime scene that would take years to fully process. In March of 2011, the remains of 4 additional individuals were found in the same general area, east of the original Gilgo Beach discoveries. These remains were not wrapped in burlap and were scattered over a wider area, and they included the partial remains of a male and a female toddler, later identified through DNA as the children of a woman named Valerie Mack, who had been missing since 2000. The other remains in this group included a woman identified as Jessica Taylor, who had gone missing from Manhattan in 2003, and an unidentified woman who became known in the media as Peaches because of a distinctive tattoo on her torso. A 10th set of remains, discovered in April of 2011, was identified as Karen Vergata, a 34-year-old woman who had gone missing from Massapequa, Long Island, in 1996. The sheer scale and complexity of the Gilgo Beach discoveries presented the Suffolk County Police Department with an investigative challenge of staggering proportions. The presence of multiple sets of remains, disposed of in slightly different manners and over a period of more than a decade, raised the immediate and critical question of whether a single killer was responsible for all of the deaths or whether multiple killers had used the same remote stretch of coastline as a dumping ground. The 4 victims found in burlap sacks, who became known in the media as the Gilgo 4, were believed by investigators to be the work of a single offender, given the identical method of disposal. The other remains, which were not wrapped in burlap and showed different patterns of decomposition and disposal, were treated as possibly the work of a different killer or killers, though the possibility that a single offender had changed his methods over time could not be ruled out. The investigation into the Long Island serial killer became one of the largest and most expensive in the history of Suffolk County, involving dozens of detectives, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, and a vast array of forensic specialists. Despite the massive investment of resources, the investigation moved slowly and was plagued by criticism from the families of the victims, from the media, and from the public, who accused the Suffolk County Police Department of incompetence, institutional secrecy, and a failure to adequately pursue leads that might have identified the killer earlier. A particularly damaging revelation emerged in 2016 when it was reported that a police officer had been tipped off about the existence of human remains on the barrier island as early as 2008, 2 years before the official discovery, and that this information had not been properly acted upon. The officer, a former New York City police officer named James Burke, who had by that time risen to the position of Suffolk County Police Chief, was later convicted of federal civil rights violations in an unrelated case involving the beating of a suspect in police custody, and his conduct during the Gilgo Beach investigation became the subject of intense scrutiny and allegations of a cover-up. The years passed without an arrest, and the case seemed to be drifting toward the status of a permanent unsolved mystery, joining the ranks of other notorious serial killer cases like the Zodiac and the Green River Killer that had remained open for decades. Then, in July of 2023, more than 12 years after the first remains were discovered on Gilgo Beach, the Suffolk County Police Department announced a dramatic breakthrough. A 60-year-old architect named Rex Hoyerman, who lived in Massapequa Park, a suburban community approximately 15 miles north of the Gilgo Beach discovery site, was arrested and charged with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo 4 victims, Melissa Barthelemy, Amber Costello, and Megan Waterman. He was later charged with the murder of the 4th Gilgo 4 victim, Maureen Brainerd Barnes. The arrest of Rex Hoyerman was the culmination of a covert investigation that had been underway for more than 3 years, led by a new task force that had been assembled under the direction of a new Suffolk County Police Commissioner, Rodney Harrison, who had been brought in to reform the department and to apply fresh energy and new investigative techniques to the stalled case. The task force had used a combination of traditional detective work, advanced DNA technology, and sophisticated digital forensic analysis to build a case against Hoyerman that was built, like the Paul Flores case, almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, but that was, in its scale and detail, extraordinarily compelling. The digital forensic component of the investigation was particularly groundbreaking. Investigators had determined that the killer had used burner phones, prepaid cellular devices that could be purchased anonymously and discarded after use, to contact the victims and to arrange the meetings that led to their deaths. By analyzing the digital records of these burner phones, including cell tower data that could pinpoint the approximate location of the phones at specific times, investigators were able to establish a pattern that linked the burner phones used to contact the Gilgo 4 victims to a specific geographical area in and around Massapequa Park, the neighborhood where Rex Hoyerman lived and worked. Cell tower data showed that the burner phones used to call Melissa Barthelemy had traveled from the Massapequa Park area to the Gilgo Beach area on the night she disappeared, and that the same phones had then traveled back to Massapequa Park, a pattern that was consistent with the killer traveling from his home to the disposal site and back. Further analysis revealed that the burner phones had been used to make calls to numbers associated with Hoyerman's known phone numbers, and that the burner phones had been activated and deactivated in locations that were physically near locations where Hoyerman was known to be at the same times. The DNA evidence against Hoyerman, while not a direct match, was highly suggestive. Investigators recovered a male hair from the burlap sack that had contained the remains of Megan Waterman. The hair was submitted for advanced mitochondrial DNA analysis, a technique that can identify maternal genetic lineages but is less precise than nuclear DNA analysis. The mitochondrial DNA profile developed from the hair was consistent with the mitochondrial DNA profile of Rex Hoyerman's mother, meaning that the hair could have come from Hoyerman or from a maternal relative. While this evidence was not sufficient to definitively identify Hoyerman as the source of the hair, when combined with the cell tower data, the geographical analysis, and other circumstantial evidence, it formed a powerful web of inference that pointed overwhelmingly in his direction. In addition, investigators recovered DNA from a pizza crust that Hoyerman had discarded in a trash can near his office in Midtown Manhattan, and this DNA was used to confirm his genetic profile for comparison purposes. The portrait of Rex Hoyerman that emerged from the investigation was one of a man who had constructed a meticulously maintained facade of normalcy and respectability that concealed a terrifying and methodical predatory existence. Hoyerman was a licensed architect who ran a small but apparently successful firm that specialized in the design and renovation of commercial buildings and residential properties in the New York City area. He was married, the father of 2 children, and was described by neighbors and acquaintances as a quiet, unremarkable figure who kept to himself and showed no outward signs of the violence that prosecutors alleged lurked beneath the surface. He lived in a modest home in Massapequa Park that was located within a short driving distance of Ocean Parkway, and he possessed an intimate knowledge of the Long Island Barrier Island system that would have enabled him to select and access the remote disposal sites with confidence and precision. He was also, according to the prosecution, a prolific consumer of violent pornography and a frequenter of sex work websites, including Craigslist, where he allegedly used the same platforms as his victims to arrange encounters under a series of false identities. The trial of Rex Hoyerman has not yet taken place as of the present, and he has pleaded not guilty to all charges. He is being held without bail at a Suffolk County correctional facility. The prosecution of Hoyerman, while representing a monumental breakthrough in the case, does not resolve the full scope of the Long Island serial killer mystery. Hoyerman has been charged with the murders of the Gilgo 4, but the remains of the other individuals discovered along Ocean Parkway, including Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, Karen Vergata, and the unidentified toddler, have not been formally linked to him by the prosecution, and the question of whether a single killer was responsible for all of the Gilgo Beach remains or whether multiple predators used the same desolate stretch of coastline as a dumping ground remains an open and deeply unsettling question. The family of Shannon Gilbert, whose disappearance triggered the discovery of the Gilgo Beach remains, has maintained for years that Shannon was also a victim of the serial killer, a theory that has been disputed by the Suffolk County Medical Examiner, who ruled Shannon's death an accidental drowning, possibly the result of a panic attack or a drug-induced episode in the marshes. However, the circumstances of Shannon's disappearance, including her frantic 911 call and her reported screams about someone trying to kill her, have left many people, including her family and numerous independent investigators, convinced that her death was not an accident and that she may have been the first victim of the killer who would later deposit the remains of the Gilgo Four on the same stretch of coastline. The Long Island serial killer case has exposed the profound vulnerability of women who work in the sex trade, a population that is disproportionately targeted by predators precisely because the women are often marginalized, distrustful of law enforcement, and less likely to be missed or searched for by mainstream society. The fact that the killer was able to operate for more than a decade, murdering women from across the northeastern United States and transporting their bodies to a single location on Long Island, without being detected or apprehended, is a damning indictment of the systems that failed to protect these women and that allowed their disappearances to be treated as low-priority cases by law enforcement agencies that were slow to recognize the pattern. The case has also exposed the institutional failures and the culture of secrecy within the Suffolk County Police Department, which allowed the investigation to stagnate for years and which may have delayed the identification of the killer by a decade or more. For the families of the victims, the arrest of Rex Heuermann was a moment of profound emotional intensity, a validation of the years they had spent fighting for attention and resources for a case that many in the community had wanted to forget. But the unresolved questions, the additional remains that have not been linked to a suspect, the absence of a body in the Shannon Gilbert case, and the specter of a possible second killer operating in the same area, ensure that the Long Island serial killer mystery, even with a defendant in custody, remains one of the most complex, disturbing, and unfinished criminal investigations in American history. The 13 miles of ocean parkway between Gilgo Beach and Jones Beach, once a scenic route to the summer shore, have been permanently altered in the public imagination, transformed from a road of leisure into a corridor of death, a place where the darkness of the Pine Barrens hides secrets that may never be fully brought to light. Number 10. The Delphi Murders. On a cold and gray February afternoon in 2017, the small town of Delphi, Indiana, a quiet and close-knit community of approximately 3,000 residents located in the rolling farmland of Carroll County, about 70 miles northwest of Indianapolis, was preparing for what should have been an unremarkable Monday. The local schools, including Delphi Community Middle School, were operating on a scheduled day off, a rare midwinter break that gave students a reprieve from their academic routines. It was on this idle afternoon that two 13-year-old girls, Abigail Williams, known to her family and friends as Abby, and Liberty German, known as Libby, made plans to spend the afternoon together outdoors. Abby and Libby were 8th graders at Delphi Community Middle School, and they were the kind of friends who seemed to complement each other perfectly. Abby was described by those who knew her as a gentle, creative, and somewhat shy girl who loved animals, art, and music, and who had a warm smile that could light up a room. Libby was more outgoing and spirited, a bold and adventurous girl with a quick wit and a fiercely loyal personality who was known for her love of sports and her willingness to stand up for her friends. The two girls had become close in middle school, and their friendship was one of those effortless adolescent bonds that seems to promise years of shared experiences and inside jokes. On the afternoon of February 13, 2017, Libby's older sister, Kelsey German, dropped the two girls off at the Monon High Bridge Trail, a popular and picturesque hiking path that follows an abandoned railroad right-of-way through a densely wooded ravine north of town. The trail is known for its centerpiece, the Monon High Bridge, a historic 75-foot-high trestle bridge that spans Deer Creek and offers stunning views of the surrounding forested valley. The bridge and the surrounding trail are a beloved local landmark, frequented by hikers, photographers, and nature enthusiasts, and dropping two 13-year-old girls off at the trail on a weekday afternoon in a town like Delphi would not have seemed, to any reasonable parent or guardian, like an action that carried any significant risk. Kelsey German dropped the girls off at the trailhead at approximately 1:35 in the afternoon and made plans to pick them up at the same location at approximately 3:30. The girls began walking the trail, and at some point during their hike, they took out their smartphones and began posting photographs and videos to social media, a perfectly normal activity for teenagers of their generation. One of the photographs they posted showed them walking together on the high bridge, smiling and seemingly enjoying their afternoon. It was the last photograph that would ever be taken of them alive. When Kelsey German arrived at the trailhead at 3:30, Abby and Libby were not there. She called their cell phones repeatedly, but the calls went unanswered. As the minutes turned into an hour, and as the winter darkness began to close in over the woods, a growing sense of alarm spread through the German and Williams families. By early evening, the families had contacted the Carroll County Sheriff's Office to report the girls as missing, and a search and rescue operation was launched. Volunteers, firefighters, and law enforcement officers combed the trail and the surrounding woods throughout the night and into the following morning, February 14th, Valentine's Day, a date that would forever be stripped of its romantic associations for the people of Delphi. At approximately noon on February 14th, a volunteer searcher discovered the bodies of Abigail Williams and Liberty German in a heavily wooded area on private property near the north bank of Deer Creek, approximately half a mile downstream from the Monon High Bridge and about 3/4 of a mile from the trailhead where the girls had been dropped off. The location was not easily accessible from the main trail, suggesting that the killer had either lured the girls off the trail or had forced them into the rugged and secluded terrain. The condition of the bodies and the specific cause of death were not immediately disclosed by law enforcement, a deliberate decision that was made to preserve the integrity of the ongoing investigation, but the sheer horror of the discovery and the youth of the victim sent a shockwave of grief and terror through Delphi and the surrounding communities. The investigation into the murders of Abby and Libby began immediately and would eventually become one of the largest and most intensely scrutinized criminal investigations in the history of the state of Indiana. In the critical early hours and days of the case, however, the breakthrough that would define the entire investigation came not from forensic evidence found at the scene but from a source that was almost miraculous in its existence and its timing. During the investigation, it was discovered that Liberty German, in the moments before her death, had used her smartphone to record a brief video clip and to capture a single photograph of the man who would become the prime suspect in the case. The video, which was later released to the public in an edited form by the Carroll County Sheriff's Office, showed a man walking along the abandoned railroad tracks on the high bridge, approaching the girls from behind. The man was dressed in dark clothing, including a dark jacket and what appeared to be blue jeans, and he was moving with a deliberate and purposeful stride. In the background of the video, barely audible beneath the sound of wind and footsteps, a voice that was believed to belong to the man could be heard saying, "Down the hill," a phrase that investigators believed was a command directed at the girls, ordering them to leave the bridge and descend the steep embankment into the secluded woods below. The photograph, which was also released to the public, showed a slightly clearer image of the man's face and upper body, revealing a white or light-skinned male who appeared to be middle-aged, with a slight build, short brown hair, and a facial appearance that was described by some as weathered or ruddy. The composite image created from the video and the photograph, showing the man walking on the bridge, became one of the most widely distributed and recognized wanted images in the history of American criminal investigation, appearing on television news programs, social media platforms, billboards, and posters across the country and around the world. The release of the audio and video evidence was an unprecedented decision by the Carroll County Sheriff's Office and the Indiana State Police, who were leading the joint investigation. The decision was driven by the desperate need to identify the suspect as quickly as possible, and it represented a calculated gamble that releasing the evidence to the public would generate more leads than it would compromise the investigation. The gamble paid off in the sense that the released evidence generated an enormous volume of tips, with law enforcement receiving tens of thousands of calls and online submissions from people who believed they recognized the man on the bridge or who had information about the case. However, the sheer volume of tips was overwhelming, and the investigation became bogged down in the effort to process, prioritize, and follow up on each one. For more than 5 years, the Delphi murders investigation seemed to be stuck in a cycle of renewed hope and crushing disappointment. Every few months, a new piece of information would leak to the media or be released by law enforcement, generating a fresh wave of public interest and speculation, but each wave would eventually recede without producing a definitive break in the case. In 2019, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office released a revised sketch of the suspect, drawn by a forensic artist based on additional information that had not been previously available. The new sketch depicted a man who looked significantly younger than the figure in the bridge video, with a rounder face and a different jawline, leading to widespread confusion and debate about whether the new sketch represented a different suspect or a different interpretation of the same suspect. Law enforcement later clarified that the new sketch was believed to be a more accurate representation of the man who had committed the murders, and that the original composite image, which had been derived directly from the video still, might not have accurately depicted the suspect's true appearance due to the poor quality of the footage. In 2021, investigators announced that they had identified a new person of interest in the case but declined to release the individual's name, a decision that frustrated the public and the families of the victims but that was justified by law enforcement as necessary to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigation. The years of uncertainty took an enormous toll on the families of Abby and Libby. Mike Patty, Libby's grandfather, who had raised Libby and her sister Kelsey, became a particularly vocal and visible advocate for the case, appearing on national television programs and using social media to keep the investigation in the public eye and to pressure law enforcement to make an arrest. Anna Williams, Abby's mother, also became a tireless advocate, speaking about her daughter's murder with a raw and unflinching honesty that commanded respect and empathy. The families lived in a state of suspended animation, unable to grieve fully or to move forward because the person who had taken their daughters from them was still out there, unidentified and unpunished. The town of Delphi itself was transformed by the murders. The Monon High Bridge Trail, once a place of innocent recreation and natural beauty, became a place of pilgrimage and mourning, festooned with flowers, teddy bears, ribbons, and handwritten messages from visitors who came from across the country to pay their respects to the two girls whose lives had been cut short in such a senseless and brutal manner. The town was gripped by a pervasive sense of fear and suspicion, as residents realized that the killer was likely someone who lived in or near their community, someone they might pass on the street or see at the grocery store, someone who was hiding a monstrous secret behind a facade of normalcy. The breakthrough that the families and the town had been waiting for finally came on October 26, 2022, when the Carroll County Prosecutor's Office and the Indiana State Police announced the arrest of Richard Matthew Allen, a 50-year-old resident of Delphi, on 2 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of Abigail Williams and Liberty German. Allen was taken into custody without incident at his home in Delphi, a residence located less than a mile from the Monon High Bridge Trail. The arrest of Richard Allen was a seismic event in the Delphi case and in the true crime community at large, but it was accompanied by an extraordinary and unprecedented veil of secrecy. The Carroll County prosecutor, a man named Nicholas McClelland, and the lead investigator from the Indiana State Police held a press conference to announce the arrest but provided almost no information about the evidence that had led to Allen's identification as the suspect. The probable cause affidavit, the legal document that is typically filed at the time of an arrest to outline the factual basis for the charges, was sealed by court order and was not made available to the public or to the media. This extraordinary level of secrecy was justified by the prosecution on the grounds that releasing the details of the evidence could prejudice the potential jury pool and compromise the defendant's right to a fair trial. However, the secrecy also fueled an explosion of speculation, rumor, and conspiracy theory on social media and in the true crime community, as thousands of armchair investigators attempted to fill the informational void with their own theories and analyses. Over the following months, fragments of information about the case against Richard Allen did eventually emerge through court hearings, defense filings, and the selective leaking of details to the media. Richard Allen was, by all external appearances, an utterly ordinary man. He was a married father of 2 who had worked for years as a pharmacy technician at a local CVS store in Delphi. He had no known criminal history, no history of violence, and no apparent connection to the Williams or German families. He was a member of the community, a man who bagged prescriptions and stocked shelves and who lived a quiet, unremarkable life that, on the surface, bore absolutely no resemblance to the profile of a double murderer. The evidence against Allen, as it was gradually revealed through the partially unsealed court documents, appeared to be a combination of circumstantial and forensic elements. Allen had allegedly admitted to being on the Monon High Bridge Trail on the afternoon of February 13, 2017, a fact that he had initially denied to investigators during an interview that was conducted in the years before his arrest. According to the probable cause affidavit, which was eventually partially unsealed in 2023, Allen told investigators that he had parked his vehicle near the trail and had walked onto the bridge, but he claimed that he had not seen the girls and had left the area without incident. However, cell phone records and cell tower data obtained by investigators allegedly placed Allen's phone in the immediate vicinity of the high bridge at the precise time that the girls were there, a fact that contradicted his initial account and placed him at the crime scene at the critical moment. Additionally, an unspent .40 caliber round of ammunition that was recovered from the ground near the location where the girls' bodies were found was allegedly linked to a firearm that Allen owned, though the specific nature of this forensic link has not been fully disclosed. Perhaps the most disturbing piece of evidence to emerge from the unsealed documents was the content of a series of journal entries that Allen allegedly wrote while being held in the county jail awaiting trial. According to the prosecution, Allen wrote in his journal that he had seen the girls on the bridge and that they were going this way, and I was going that way, a statement that prosecutors argued was an attempt to construct a false narrative that minimized his involvement in the crimes. In other entries, Allen allegedly made statements that were interpreted by prosecutors as admissions of guilt, though the defense has argued that these entries are the ramblings of a man who is suffering from severe mental health deterioration as a result of his prolonged incarceration in solitary confinement. The defense team for Richard Allen, led by a prominent Indianapolis defense attorney named Andrew Baldwin, has mounted an aggressive and multifaceted challenge to the prosecution's case. The defense has argued that the evidence against Allen is entirely circumstantial, that the cell phone data is insufficient to place him at the exact location of the murders, that the ammunition link is tenuous and has been overstated by the prosecution, and that the journal entries are inadmissible because they were obtained in violation of Allen's constitutional rights. The defense has also filed numerous motions challenging the conduct of the investigation, including allegations that Allen was interrogated without proper legal representation and that evidence was mishandled or destroyed by law enforcement. The legal proceedings in the Delphi murder case have been marked by extraordinary delays, procedural wrangling, and a level of judicial secrecy that is virtually unprecedented in a case of this magnitude. The trial, which was originally scheduled for early 2024, has been delayed multiple times due to pretrial motions, disputes over the admissibility of evidence, and changes in Allen's legal representation. As of the present moment, Richard Allen remains in custody at the Westville Correctional Facility in northern Indiana, awaiting a trial date that has not yet been firmly established. The murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German remain, from a legal standpoint, an unsolved mystery. Richard Allen has been charged with the crimes, but he has not been convicted, and the presumption of innocence that is the cornerstone of the American legal system means that until a jury renders a verdict or Allen enters a guilty plea, the question of who killed Abby and Libby remains technically and officially open. The absence of a trial and a verdict means that the full story of what happened on the Monon High Bridge on that cold February afternoon in 2017 has not been told in a court of law, and the evidence that the prosecution has assembled against Allen has not been subjected to the crucible of cross-examination and adversarial testing that is designed to separate reliable proof from unreliable speculation. For the families of Abby and Libby, the arrest of Richard Allen brought a surge of relief and hope that had been absent for more than 5 years, but the subsequent delays and the shroud of secrecy that has enveloped the proceedings have made the wait for justice an agonizing and emotionally exhausting experience. The town of Delphi, which rallied around the families in the aftermath of the murders with an outpouring of love and support that was both moving and humbling, continues to carry the weight of the tragedy, a weight that is felt every time someone drives past the trailhead on County Road or looks out over the Deer Creek Valley from the high bridge. The image of the man on the bridge, captured in the last moments of Liberty German's life by a 13-year-old girl who had the presence of mind and the courage to activate her phone's video camera in the face of unimaginable terror, remains one of the most haunting and powerful pieces of evidence in the history of true crime. It is an image that simultaneously captures the banal ordinariness of evil, a man in a jacket walking on a bridge on a winter afternoon, and the cosmic horror of what that ordinariness concealed. The Delphi murders case is a story about the fragility of innocence, the devastating randomness of violence, the courage of a young girl who fought back in the only way she could, and the agonizingly slow and imperfect machinery of the criminal justice system. It is a story that is not yet finished, a mystery that has not yet been resolved, and a wound in a small Indiana town that will not fully heal until the truth, the complete and unvarnished truth, is finally brought into the light.